All right. So today we're going to go over the Microsoft Dynamics GP orientation for W Squared, and we're going to talk about the core modules that we use here at W Squared. Just to go over a very high-level summary so that you guys going into GP will have some sort of navigation around GP before you start working in it. Just to kind of start off the way GP is set up, if you notice in this home page that we're on right now, the look and feel of GP is very similar to a lot of the other Microsoft products that you have used in the past, meaning Outlook or Excel or Word, things like that. And that's the way Microsoft is going with all their products. If you use CRM, anything like that, it'll have very similar feel and look to it. Starting with, you do have the ribbon bar up at the top, or the toolbar. You do have the navigation pane along the left side over here, and then you kind of have your home screen or your main work area right here in the middle, just like every other Microsoft product. The modules we'll go over today are, we're going to start with the home page and the navigation screens to work around GP. We'll talk about the financials module. We'll talk about the purchasing module, the sales module, and then we'll touch base a little bit on the fixed asset module, and then go over some of the third-party products that we use here at W Squared that might be new for some people that have used Great Plains, or it'll just be a learning experience for somebody who has not used Great Plains. We'll also talk about Smart List and Integration Manager, which are standard options in Great Plains, and we'll just touch base on those just to kind of explain exactly what they are, but not go in depth with them, as you could spend days training on that kind of stuff. So beginning with the home page, I talked about the toolbar up at the top. Pretty much every module is broken down into these 4 menu options of transactions, inquiry, reports, and cards, and that's kind of the way that we'll focus on the training today. However, there are many ways to get around. You don't have to use these menu options. You can use many other ways to get around at GP. Starting with the menu options, as we said, are transactions, inquiry, reports, and cards. Transactions are where you're going to post items. Inquiry is where you're looking up reports. You can go in and run trial balances, things of that nature, account listings, all kinds of checkbook registers, things like that. And then cards is kind of where your master files sit for your vendors, your customers, and your GL chart of accounts, things like that. I kind of refer to the cards as kind of a Rolodex for the accounting system. You'll notice these icons, I call them the shortcut icons. They are customizable at the top, and basically what they do is allow you to just have one click to different windows in GP. You can customize each shortcut icon, and you can take away icons and you can add one. To go in and customize it, all you do is click in the blue toolbar. You just right click, and then so right now I've got the main, the financial, and the sales icons. If I wanted to add, for instance, the purchasing icons, just simply click on purchasing, and now you'll see these new icons come up here. And then you can hover over each one, and it'll kind of tell you what window it will take you to. To customize each one of them, you just right-click again on the toolbar and go to Customize. And then you just, in the drop-down, you just select which one you're going to try to customize. So let's say if I wanted to customize purchasing, I click on that. Then I can add or delete, move up or down, anything like that. To add, I just simply hit Add. And then now I'm just navigating off of my normal menu selections of, let's say, transactions. I want to add purchasing, and I want to add manual payments. So I just navigate like that, hit OK, and now I've got manual payments in my list. When I hit OK, you'll notice that this little icon added up to my shortcut bar, so it's the manual payments icon. You can also move them around if you want, just by grabbing the little bar in front of it and moving them up and down, things like that. Once you get it the way you want it, it's definitely a good idea to lock the toolbar. And what that does is makes it so that you can't move stuff around if you accidentally click on it, things like that. So definitely lock it down. Another way to get around in GP are these navigation panes on the lower left-hand corner. What they do is, instead of having the menu options up top and having to go transactions, financial, and then picking something, or some of these, if we go like into advanced bank rec, you got to click more arrows and open up more navigations. You can simply, if you spend most of your time in one of the modules, you can select these navigation panes down here, and you have everything right in front of you on one home screen. So for instance, if I'm an accountant, I'm spending a lot of time in the financial module. I just have my financial navigation pane open, and then I've got everything right in front of me so that I don't have to navigate through the menu options. So I can just click General to open a general journal entry window. And at the same time, I can just simply open, let's say I need to add a new chart of account. I can just open account right there, and it's all right in front of me instead of navigating through the menu options. My opinion is it's a lot easier to get started this way. Some of the old school users that have been around since version 9 are used to the menu options, but I definitely, if you spend a lot of time in one module, these navigation panes are very useful to have everything right in front of you. And you can delete these as well. So let's say if you don't need field service, you just come into navigation panes and uncheck that field service, and then it's gone. Or you can move things up as well, move them up and down, however, whatever order you want them on. So you can customize GP, to your liking pretty easily. So navigation panes, same core modules, same type of modules that we're going to be talking about today. Those are all part of the navigation pane options down at the bottom left-hand corner. And then when we get back to our home page, one thing you'll notice is you have these boxes on the home page if you are on the home navigation pane. You can add tasks and reminders in GP, maybe for company-specific reminders of, hey, send money out, do a wire transfer every 2 weeks, or payrolls every 2 weeks. You can add that kind of stuff in the to-do list. GP is integrated with Outlook so that your meetings and your emails will show up here. You can also click on any one of your meetings or things like that, and it will open up Outlook and show you the meeting in Outlook. The quick links, what those are is you can simply add, instead of possibly using the shortcut icons up top, you can add quick links to specific windows, reports, things like that in GP. And all you're going to do is simply click on the little pencil in the box, and then you just add, you can add a window, you can add a list. One of the good things about quick links you can also add is web pages or files on the server. So for instance, if you have a bank account, let's say you have maybe 4 or 5 clients that use SunTrust or one bank, you can say, oh, I want to add this web page, and then you just type in the address for the web page that you want, and it becomes a quick link over here, and to where then you can just click on it right there instead of having to open Internet Explorer, then go to your favorites, things like that. You can do all that right here. Makes it a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. I also mentioned you could open files or programs in here. So let's say if you have a file that you constantly refer to on a daily basis or something like that, you can make it a shortcut in here so that let's say it's an Excel, even a program, you can link it to that Excel executable file. That then you can just open it straight here instead of going down to the start option and then going that way and navigating that way. So again, make it user-friendly and make it the way that you want it to, make the system work for you the way you want it to. We also have my reports. These are reports that we'll get to later on how to add these, but if you wanted to add trial balances and stuff, you can simply just add those to my reports, and then once you have the parameters set up correctly, you can just simply click my report and it will automatically print it to the screen or things like that, however you have that report saved. So I don't think a whole lot of people use this, but it can be very beneficial. Things I've used it for in the past is my AP trial balance or my AR trial balance, as well as my GL trial balance for previous months. If I'm closing February and I'm in the middle of March, I set up the reports to run for the beginning of previous period to end of previous period, and then it'll always pick up the month that you're closing. You can customize these features as well just by clicking on Customize This Page, and then when that comes up, it's just a check mark to say, hey, I don't want Outlook to show up on my home page, or I don't want quick links, things like that. You can also add metrics, which would give you maybe your outstanding AP or give you outstanding AR, things like that. And this is not coming up right now. If that were to come up and the server wasn't going slow, you would be able to see it's very easy. It's just a check mark to say, hey, I don't want this on my home screen, or I do want this, things like that. And you can move it around to wherever you want it. Couple other things with the home page that you can do. Any window that you open in Great Plains, you can add to as a shortcut right here. Just another option of adding shortcuts. So for instance, if I go Transactions, Financial, General, open that page, all I have to do is hit File and Add to Shortcuts, and then you see the transaction entry shows up right over here. Where I highly suggest using these shortcuts are for windows where you're going deep into the navigation menus. If you use that, then you can simply just add it there, and then you just click on it and say, okay, transaction entry, there you go. Just another way to kind of navigate through the system a little bit easier. The Microsoft Dynamics GP logo, I'll always refer to it as that. I don't really know what they call it, but this is where you have a lot of your tools. This is where you would go in to set up new modules if you were to do that. I spend a lot of time in there because that's where your administrative stuff is, of security setups, things like that you guys might not have access to. But this is also very valuable because there are utilities where that are out there, such as Reconcile, such as Reconcile to GL, things like that. And then there are also routines out here where you're going in and year-end close, which you may or may not do. But there's a lot of other things out here under the little Microsoft Dynamics GP. One of the big things that we'll talk about a little bit later is Smart List. That is also under the Microsoft Dynamics GP logo, as well as user preferences. And one of the important things to remember about user preferences, so you can go in and you can change your password here. We set up everybody with a standard password. Once you start and get into the system, I highly recommend changing this so that nobody can log in as you. So you just simply go to user preferences, hit password, type in the old password, and then verify with the new one. One other thing I always recommend is when we have in the user preferences, the default sales doc type is usually set to quote, just straight out of the box. I always recommend to go in and change that to invoice. And what that will do is we'll show you a little bit later, but in SOP we don't use a normal sales order processing where you create a quote, raise it to an order, or take an order and then raise it to an invoice. We pretty much go in and do straight invoicing. So you don't want it to default to quote, because then every time you go into sales order processing, you have to change that to invoice. So if you do it right here, it just makes it a little bit easier. Under the user preferences and display, you can also customize, the font colors, things like that, and font styles. You have two main fields that you're looking at on this. One is the linked fields, and one is the required fields. Required fields is just basically telling you in that form you have to have this field filled out. Default, I think, is font color black, and font style is actually regular. I would highly recommend, if it's not, to change it to bold. That way, if you are ever, sometimes you'll be going in and keying into a window, and you try to save or try to post, and it'll say you can't because not all fields or required fields are filled out. Well, if you've got it bolded, it very easily, jumps out at you to say this is one of them. And what the what the linked fields are is inside of GP. If, for instance, let's say I'm looking at a GL transaction that originated in the purchasing module, I can basically link from that GL transaction back to that purchasing transaction where the distribution was originated, just by using these linked fields. And we'll go through that once we start getting into the different modules. But, if you want to, default is going to be blue and underlined, but you can change it to different colors if you want. Some people like to customize it that way. And you can make it stand out the way you want it to. Pretty much everything else, you can add default report destination of screen versus printer, and how you like to tab through the fields, whether it's a tab or an enter key. Most people don't play with that. They just leave that the way it is, but it is an option for you there. So that takes care of mainly the user preferences. A couple other things to note on the home screen. Down at the bottom left-hand corner, under the navigation panes, is what we call the system date and the company and the user that you're logged into. To simply change a company, if you just click on the company down in the lower left-hand corner, you can just simply click on it. It pulls up the screen, and then you can just change. Let's say if you're going into a tape online, you can just hit T now, and then keep hitting T until the company that you want comes up. So you don't have to go through and do the drop down and look through it, or spend a ton of time doing that. You can just simply do that and then hit OK, and it'll log you into that new company. One of the other things that is helpful to use is this system date. So what happens, this is kind of the default system date that you're using if you open up Windows, and basically the transaction date. If you're closing February, you may want your system date to default to 2/29 every time you enter a general transaction or an AP or something like that. So if you go in here and change this system date, we'll just change it to February 29th, and then I go in and open a general ledger transaction, this transaction date is going to default for you. So that some people do it just because it's ease of keying it. Some people do it because they forget to change the date when they're typing in a general transaction. And so that way it just helps you, post to the correct period and things like that. So another little helpful hint that will help you through the process. So now we will move on to the financials, which is kind of the core module that everybody uses, and then we'll move on to sales and purchasing after we get done with the financials. I'm going to use the navigation pane just because it's a little bit easier with everything right in front of you. We're going to talk about, we'll go in order of transactions, inquiries, and cards, and then reports, just because that's kind of the general way that you guys will be using GP. So under transactions, there's really three types of transactions that we look at when we're talking about the financial module. We've got the general transaction, clearing transaction, and quick journal. 90% of the time you're going to just be doing a general transaction. That's just, simple general entry to the GL. Not a big, hard process by any means. You can see that the items that are required are the journal entry number, transaction date, source document, and reference. The journal entry is going to default. That's just a system-generated count. Intercompany. Intercompany is one thing that we will never check here at W Squared because we use a third-party product to create the intercompany. This is the native GP intercompany, so just kind of forget that that's even there because we won't be using it. Batch ID. So there's two types of posting. One is transaction posting. One is batch posting. Transaction posting is, hey, I go in, I type a journal entry, and then I hit post up here at the top. Go in, type another one, hit post, and you just do that with each transaction. A lot of times you might want to do use batch posting for a couple reasons. One, when we're using our third-party product, which is called multi-entity, you have to have a batch to create the intercompany. But two, because you may want to put a bunch of transactions into one batch. You can run FRX reports off posted and unposted transactions. So you can do that and then see what it does to your financial reports. Or sometimes it's just a little bit easier to do batch posting because maybe I have like 3 or 4 batches out there. I can go in and do series post if it's saved to a batch. Or you can start a transaction. You may not be 100% sure if that's the correct transaction. So you can go ahead and save it to a batch. You cannot save an entry if it's not in a batch. So if I were to go in here and I were to say, okay, we're going to create a batch called test. If that batch is not out there, it's going to ask me, do I want to add it? You just hit add. Everything defaults for you and hit save. And then now I can add everything to this test batch. If you want to look up to see if the batch ID is created out there, all you have to do is this little magnifying glass is the lookup screen or the lookup window. Just click on that. These are the available batches that are out there, so obviously I only have one batch that's available right now. If there were multiple batches, it would be, you would have multiple lines here. The one thing to always watch out on that is if I was using this batch ID called test and I did the lookup, it's going to default to that test batch, and that'll be the first line. If I had another batch that was called, January postings, that batch would not show up right here because you have to use this little scrolling window. And if you click up, it would show you extra batches. So if you know you have a batch out there and you can't see it, always hit this scrolling window first to see if it's higher up on the list. It's all going to depend how you do the lookup. When we tab, we can do reversing entries. These are useful for accruals, meaning payroll accruals or expense accruals. All we do is click reversing, and then it allows me to put in a separate date to create the GL reversal. You will not see that down here in this when you start keying stuff. It does not actually create the reversing entry until you hit post. Once you hit post, if you were to print out the GL ledger, it would show you both entries, and it would be the same journal entry number up here. So keep that in mind if you're doing any sort of accruals to make sure you make it reversing, and then you can type in the month that you want it to reverse in. The source document in this window is always going to be GJ for general journal, but if you were doing an inquiry on the transaction, you might see if it comes from a payables transaction, if it comes from a sales transaction, you could see another source document right there. But for our sake, we don't need to change anything on that. The header or the reference is just going to be an overall description for the journal entry. Let's just say it's monthly bank fees. So we can do that. Then as I'm going in, I'm going to start picking the accounts that I'm going to post the entry to. If you know the account, you can just simply type it in. So let's say I know it's this is the account. and then let's say I forget. If I forget at this point, I can go up here and do the lookup next to the account, and it's going to default to the first. It should default if you have account numbers sorted by. It should default to the first number that it comes to that has 014200. So right there, it's going to go down to that first one. Now, if I had 2006, it would go to, it would default to that first option that it could, and so forth, and going on with that. When doing the lookup, you have multiple options to search by. You can search by the full account number or the description just by clicking on the column headings. But you also have these additional sorts. So I could do it by a main segment, meaning that last 5 digits. And then it's going to sort everything based off that last 5 digits. And then I can go up here and say, oh, I want retained earnings. And boom, there you go. Or members' interest. And it'll take you down to that first window there. One other thing you can do is simply, once you do the lookup, you can do a search where I want it to, if you hit the binoculars right here, it's kind of an advanced search. I can search it a little bit better by saying, okay, I want my account number to begin with 01, or let's go back on that. I want the account number to contain maybe 612, and then what it's going to do is it's going to search for it. And so I only see now the accounts that have 612 in it. It doesn't matter where it's at in that string. As long as it's in there, it's going to pull it up. You can do that by description as well. Maybe revenue is in the last part of the description. You could search, I want everything that has revenue in the description, and it'll pull up everything in there. If you have any questions as to what you're searching on, you do have, it tells you right here, all records where your search criteria is happening. I can then go ahead and select one of these. It picks up my account, enter the amount, and then go on to the next account. By default, every line item here is a separate line item in the transaction. One thing that you can do, though, is these the collapse and expand arrows over on this right side. I can go in and maybe I want to put a line item description. I can say, January bank fees for that, and then maybe I have some other line item descriptions in there, and maybe I just have this as monthly cash entries or something like that. But you can put a line item description by expanding the arrows over on the right side. Once you go in here and the entry is balanced, you can simply save the transaction, and it does give you a balance down here so that you know that if there's a difference or not like that. Once it is balanced, you can save it or post it if you're doing transactional posting. One thing to also note is down here on the bottom, let's say if I'm scrolling through journal entries, just looking at some saved ones, these little arrow keys here will give you the first record that is out there, and you can scroll between the previous and next records just by using this. It's a little bit helpful instead of going up here every time and doing a lookup on saved transactions and then picking one, things like that. If you know that what you're looking at and you want to just look through every single record, it might be as easy to use these black arrows down here at the bottom. And then also it'll tell you how you want to sort those records by journal entry or by batch ID. So keep that in mind on the drop down. So I'm going to save that one out there. This screen that is coming up right now is the paper save screen. That's another product that we use. Right now, I'm not going to save anything or go into paper save. If it's asking you, do you want to save it, you can hit no because we're not fully utilizing paper save right now. Couple things also to note on this screen. To correct, let's say you go in and post a journal entry and it is incorrect, whether the date, the transaction, just whatever, you can correct that journal entry just by clicking correct. And then you have two options. You can either just back it out, or you can go in and back it out and create a correcting entry. If you back it out, you're just simply saying, I want that entry gone. I don't want it anymore. If you do a back out and create a correcting entry, maybe you just miscoded one thing, or you had one small number that was wrong, or something minor, that entry was still pretty good, but you don't want to go in and confuse things. You do a back out journal entry and create a correcting one, because then it'll reverse the first one you did, create a second entry, and then you can change that entry to whatever you want it to look like. So just helps it so that you don't have to rekey a bunch of stuff. The same thing, to the same token, let's say if last month you did an entry and then you need to do the same exact entry or one very similar to it this month, you can do a copy and find that journal entry and then just copy it. Maybe it's a payroll that didn't change, the numbers didn't change at all. You could go in and copy it, and then you don't have to rekey journal entries. Things I've used that for in the past are if I'm doing depreciation and not using the fixed asset module, that's pretty much the same every month. You can copy that. Prepaid, you can use it for anything that you just want to use over and over again. And also going back to the copy, another thing you can do is if you have a journal entry that you're going to use over and over again and it's the same entry monthly, you can make your batch, instead of it being a single-use batch, you can make it a recurring batch. So let's say if I want this one to be monthly and I'm going to post this journal entry every single month, I can go in and make it a monthly journal entry. Then when I post it, it's going to keep a date. It's going to keep tallying the dates that I've posted, and this last post date or last date posted will keep increasing so that you would know when you posted it. Most of the time, the GL, most people don't use the recurring entry. What you'll see this used a lot in is the purchasing module for like rents or monthly payments for contractors, things of that nature is where you'll see this recurring posting being used. Discard that. So that should go through most of the general entries that we're going to do. One thing you can also do is print, before you post, you can print an edit list, and this is any type of transaction. If I have an entry or a transaction up, and then I hit print right here, this is just the edit list. It's really useful in AP or in sales because you can see if there's accounts. If that entry is not going to post all the way through to the GL, it'll give you the errors. Now, if you're already in the general entry transaction, it's probably not going to give you errors, but it could give you backup that you wanted as well. And I'm going to delete this. I don't want it out there. Moving on to quick journal entries. What quick journal entries are, kind of the same thing as think about a recurring entry. What changes here, though, is you set up an ID or a template, and then the amounts might change each month. So, for example, same type of thing. I've set up in the past payroll. I've set up prepaids. I've set up just recurring entries where it's going to be the same accounts every month, but the amounts might change. So for payroll, I've set it up here to where you can just go in. It defaults all my payroll accounts, so that now all I have to do is type in the amount of each one instead of going in and rekeying all the accounts. I can add accounts to this. Same with any other screen. If you just click on a line, hit edit, insert row, it's going to go in and insert a row there so that if you want it in a particular order. Same thing, I can go in and delete a row. If I accidentally key something in wrong, you can't just highlight that row and hit delete. You have to go in and hit edit, delete row. It helps if I pick the row. Let's delete that row. Delete, and then we'll delete that row as well. one thing with quick journal entries, you do have to set up the journal ID, which is basically building that template before you can post to it. Then what happens is, so my control balance is going to be whatever my balance is down here. So if it's a credit balance, I need to put negative. If it's a debit balance, I would put 245 there. That gives me my control so that once that matches the balance down here, the offset is going to be to this account up here. Depending on how you set up that quick journal entry is whether or not you can change this account. If in the journal ID you set it up that you can't change this account, it's going to be the same account every time. But in this one, I do have it set up so I could change this account if wanted. I don't think a lot of people use quick journal entries because most people like integrations. But it is, again, it's another tool just to get something done and do it faster than what it would be to rekey it all. You can just save a quick journal entry. It doesn't have to go to a batch, or you can just post it. Either way is fine. You can't do a reversing entry in a quick journal entry. You have to do that in the regular general transactions window, and everything else is pretty much the same. We will delete that one. Moving on to the clearing entry. Most people don't use clearing entries, but I want to make everybody aware of it in case there is a reason it could be used, where if what a clearing entry does is it takes the balance from one account and moves it to another account. Now, it leaves that the original data or the details in the first account, but let's say if, maybe I post like 5 different things to one account and I realize, oh, that all went to the wrong account. I could simply, instead of creating another general transaction, I could just do a clearing account that says take that balance for that month and move it over to this account over here. Not a whole lot of people use them, but it is, again, another tool to be able to move a balance of different accounts. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the clearing entry. Moving on to the financial inquiry, we do have really 4 or 5 main things that we're going to look at in here. You have summary, detail, history summary, and history detail. Great Plains is set up to have 3 types of tables. One is work, one is open, and one is history. A work table means the transaction is entered and saved but not posted. An open table means it's posted and you're in the current year or a year that has not been closed. And then history means you've already closed that year, whether it be the GL or sales, things like that. You've closed it, so it moves it to a history table so that you don't keep looking up those records. If you are in an open year, you would select summary or detail to look at an individual account. So if I hit summary and I want to look at the cash balance for this account or for this company, I can go in here, pick the account, and then I can see the debits, credits, net change, and my period balance for this specific GL account. Now with this case, 2011 is still open for this company, so I could even go back and look at 2011 stuff. If the year is closed, you would not be able to see 2011 in this screen. You would have to go to the history summary. Like I said, the linked field. So let's say if I want to look at these transactions in January of 2011, I can highlight that line and then go into net change, which is a linked field, and it'll then bring up January 2011, all the transactions that were created in January of 2011. Now, I can very easily change that to all of 2011 just by clicking that and the redisplay. I can also pick where the source document, where this entry came from, whether it came from payables or cash receipt or it came from purchasing, things like that. So if I hit from, then you can look up and see the different types of source documents that are out there. The history summary is the exact same window. It's just in this window I have multiple years that have already been closed. So Same type of thing. You can pull up the account and drill down to the detail of it right here. The other thing that you might look up is the journal entry inquiry. What that's going to do is it's just going to, if you have a journal entry that you need to look up, so let's say I want to look up this journal entry, I can just go in and look up the details of this transaction. As I mentioned previously, so this is a payables management check, which means it came from the payables module, and it was a check that they cut. So this is the general entry that came out of it. I can drill back to the actual check details just by clicking source document. I know who this went to. I know when it was cut. I know the date that it was cut. Anything that I need to look up, I can look here. I can also, if I hit this apply button, I can then look and see, okay, what invoices in payables was this coded to, which it was 2 of them. I can also go in and look at, if I need to, look at the distribution again right there, or I can just close out the distribution or close out the payables document, zoom, and see the distribution right there as well. So either way, like I said, you can just drill back as far as you need to go. There are some other things, like I said, the checkbook register. Checkbook balance does not work in our Great Plains because we do not use the native bank rec module for Great Plains. We use a third party, which is a little bit easier that we'll talk about a little bit later. So really the checkbook reports are not that useful for you guys. Usually you want to just look at the advanced bank rec if you're looking at any banking reports. Pretty much you can look at budget versus actual if budget is loaded, and you can look at budget summary, things like that. I'm not going to go into it too much because there's not a whole lot of detail on that. Account roll-up, one thing the account roll-up does is you can add different groups of accounts. So I could add like all my fixed assets to one account group, and then it would tell me whether or not they increased or decreased for that month to know then if I need to add fixed assets to the fixed asset module. Just kind of a way to roll up and see, net changes in a group of accounts versus just looking at it as individually. Moving on to the cards, I think that pretty much takes care of the inquiry side of the financial. So moving on to the cards, the couple things that we'll look at there. First of all is the chart of accounts. This is where you're going to add new accounts. Now, 99% of the time, the accounts are already going to be in here. We have a standard chart that we, I think over the past 5 or 6 years, we've identified almost all accounts that need to be added for your expenses and your balance sheets, things like that. The one thing that does get added for every new implementation is revenue accounts and cost of goods sold accounts. Those are kind of unique to every company that we deal with because every company has different stream of revenue or different cost of goods sold. But for SG&A accounts and expense accounts, typically we've got them all set up the way that we want them, with salaries, benefits, insurance, travel, all that stuff is pretty much already set up. However, to simply add an account, all you do is simply type in the new account that you want. Once you type that in, it will bring up the information. It will default, so I'm just going to bring up an account that already exists. It did default. It would default some stuff in the description. We typically delete all that and then just type it in what we want it to say. The category, it's required, but it's not really used for much. You could use it to sort some accounts or things like that, but for the most part, it's not used for a whole lot. So just pick a category that corresponds to the account you're setting up. The most important part in setting up the new account is this posting type. What that does is tells it whether it's a balance sheet or an income statement account, and then at the year-end close, that's what rolls. If it's a balance sheet account, it rolls that balance forward to the next year. If it's an income statement account, it closes it to retained earnings when we do the GL close. So that's the most important piece when setting up new accounts, is to make sure that's correct. At the end of the year, when we do the GL close, we do double check that, but it's a lot easier to get it set up at the beginning. Typical balance, the debit and credit, all that does is when you're entering a transaction, if you enter that account and then you tab off, that just tells it where to default to a debit or credit balance. So not really important on that one which one it is. It just helps you out a little bit more. Everything else, the level of posting from the series and include and look up, that we don't deal anything with. We just keep that the same as the default. This allow account entry, what that does is if it's checked, then you can just do a general entry to that account. If it's unchecked, you can only post to it from different modules, meaning one thing this is useful for is like AP. You typically don't do general transaction entries to your AP account. It should all come from the purchasing module. If you have a problem with that, you can uncheck this so that you can't do a general ledger transaction to that. You can also make the account inactive right here just by clicking inactive. What that does is it makes it so that a warning pops up if you try to post to it, or if AP tries to post to it, or sales, whatever, it'll pop up and say, hey, this account is inactive. You're not going to be able to post to it. We typically will do that a lot if we have history in accounts that we don't want to use anymore. You can delete accounts if nothing has been posted to them. It doesn't matter if the account has a zero balance. As long as something has been posted to it, you cannot delete that account. You have to use a different tool, which is called professional service tool set, which can only be run by the SA user. So keep that in mind if you do set up incorrect accounts, that once you posted to them, you can't delete them. Under the cards, we also have the checkbook set up. So what this does is goes in, we set up our operating account, or if you have other multiple accounts, you link it to the GL account right here, and then we also tell it what the next check number is, and kind of set up the defaults for the check accounts. Most of the time, the checkbooks will be set up by the GP admins because we also have to set up the MICR, which is our check printing software that we use for GP. We do not use pre-printed checks. We use blank checks that is printed with another software. So most of the time, the GP admins will set this up. Now, if it's an account that you're not going to cut checks off of, but you still want to reconcile, maybe it's a money market account or some other type of account, you can definitely go in and set that up and then use it for bank recs and things like that. Other types of accounts that you set up that are not financial accounts, you have unit and allocation accounts. What unit accounts are is they're basically statistical accounts or non-financial accounts. Let's say if you want to track, days in AR, or you want to track working days or FTEs or visits, things like that. That's what you use unit accounts for. Is you can make them show up in FRX on the financials, and then you can do calculations in your financials off of these unit accounts. Real quick setup, it's going to follow the same string as what a GL account is, but it's going to be set up a little bit differently. As our main account, we usually use start it with the 0000, or we do the 90,000 series for stat accounts. Allocation accounts, what they are is 99% of the time fixed allocation accounts are used and not variable allocation. What a fixed allocation account does is if you're coding something to this fixed allocation account, you can then split it between as many accounts as you want based on a percentage. So let's say if you have 10 departments and you equally split rent between those 10 departments, you don't want to key in those 10 accounts every single time. So you set up a fixed allocation account to say, if I code it to account A, it then splits it by the percentage to those 10 accounts that I want it to go to. Typically, AP uses those more than the accountants do, But keep in mind, if there's a split that AP is doing, they may be doing it wrong, or it may be something that you as the accountant can show them, hey, let's set this up, you code it to this account, and then it'll do the splits for you so that you don't have to key in as much. Variable accounts are they're not used a whole lot because you're using other information in GP to allocate those entries to that account. So one thing that you might see this used for is, I have a number of FTEs. I need to allocate rent based off the number of FTEs. Well, that changes every month. So what I may do is every month I enter my FTEs as a unit account, and then I go in and enter my rent allocation. If I do it to this variable account, it'll calculate what your variable is and then split it between the accounts that you need it to. So not used a whole lot just because of the way that you already have to have pre-existing information in there to be able to use it correctly. Under cards is also where you add budget information. Typically we upload budget information off of a template, but you can also export. So if I hit Excel and I need to look at a budget, I can export it to Excel to be able to look at it. And when it exports from here into Excel, that is the same exact template that you use to upload it. So if you're ever looking for the template for a budget, this is the place to go and export one and then start with that. You can also delete budgets, things like that, but most of the time we just leave them in there. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that. We'll get to that later on. Math modify. What math modify is good for is, let's say if I'm dealing with a healthcare company that has multiple clinics, and they're constantly opening new clinics, I can set up an income statement, a range of income statement accounts. Then I can go in here and tell it I want to copy that range of accounts to create a new a new location, for instance. So basically what you would do is say copy. You would select your range of accounts, maybe a department or a clinic, and then you go down here on the new account mask and say, okay, I want it, the one I've got set up now might be 01 as the company, 42001 as the location. I may now want it to be 42002, and so it's going to copy everything that is in this range. It's going to copy it to this area right here that's in the above account range. What you can do is also look at your selected range if you have one up here. I'm not going to go through it right now because I don't want to copy it, but you can go through and mass modify and copy or change, delete, inactivate a range of accounts by using mass modify. Typically, you can't really hurt anything. You're not going to screw anything up by using mass modify. At worst case, what you're going to do is add a lot of accounts that you don't need, but then you can go back and delete them. So it's a good thing to know and use if you're adding a lot of accounts to your company. So pretty much that's going to cover the cards for the financial series. So we'll move on to the reports in the financial series. Excuse me, did not want to do that. We'll come down here and open up the reports. Most of the time, all we run is this trial balance. You can save many. I think you can actually save up to 30 report options on a trial balance. What those options could be is maybe you want just balance sheet accounts, maybe just income statement accounts, maybe you want the previous month, maybe you want it year to date. You can do all kinds of things like that and set up multiple options in here so that you don't have to keep going in and setting it up. For instance, this one is the year to date. To change the way that this works, I just click on it and hit modify, and then it's got my date range of 1/1/2010 to 12/31/2010. Now that would not run because 2010 is a closed year, but if I change it to 2011, let's change it to 2012, and I were to run it, it would pull all of my 2012 information. You can include unit accounts in here, posting accounts. You can include inactive accounts or zero balance. Most of the time I would say don't include zero balance, but you might need that for auditors. Maybe the auditor wants to look at that kind of stuff to see all of our chart of accounts or things like that. You can do subtotals right here, and you can sort by different segments in the chart. The other important thing is to know your destination. You can print it to the screen as just a report, print it to the printer, or to a file. And when you print it to a file, you can pick Excel as a CSV file, tab delimited, things like that. You can do it to PDF, all kind of different formats. When exporting to Excel, it is very ugly when you use the comma delimited. I don't know of any other way. It's just very ugly. So I'm probably not going to use Excel too often when you're exporting it that way. Under the reports, there's also kind of along the same lines as inquiry. You have a detailed report and you have a summary report. The summary is just going to give you debits, credits, and net change. The detail is going to give you every single transaction. So the financial reports are set up very similar to the inquiry screens in GP. And simply, if we know that this is set up the way we want it, we can just hit insert and hit print, and it'll either print to the printer if that's the way it's saved, or print to the screen. It'll do whatever the options are saved in that report. And then, like I said, if you want to change it, you just hit modify and go in and change it however you want. One thing, if you do print the screen, you can only have one print to screen report open. So if I go in and I print one and it's taking a while to run, I go in and then try to print a second one, that second report is not going to show up until you close out the first window. A lot of times what people will do is go in and they'll just start hitting print because they don't think it's working, and then it's going to try to print like 15 reports, but you've got to close out of that first screen report, the screen output, before it'll print the new ones. With that, I think that's going to finish up the financial module overview. Not too many things that are very difficult on the financial. You'll get to know it very quickly. We're going to move on to the sales module next, and then we'll do the purchasing module after that. Again, every module is set up the same: transactions, cards, inquiry, reports. Couple things to note on the sales transactions. Under the sales module, there's really 2 or 3 separate types of modules. One is what's called receivables management, which is kind of this section right here. Everything in the sales module eventually flows through the receivables management side. So if you do an SOP invoice, it posts to receivables management. If you do a cash receipt, that is a receivables management option. What we've got, though, is these options up here under transactions are what we call SOP. So the difference is, if I open a sales transaction entry, this is where I'm going in and I'm putting item numbers or inventory items that I keep in my cards, and I'm doing a line item transaction, basically. Whereas a transaction entry for the receivables module is, I'm just going in and saying, calling it an invoice, and then charging $10,000. There's no detail behind that invoice. The difference is most of the invoicing is done out of the sales transaction entry screen, where most of like a debit memo or a credit memo would be done out of the receivables transaction entry. If I need to write off a invoice, I would go in here and do a credit memo right here to be able to write that off. That's kind of the big differences between the two. They are set up somewhat similar in the sense that the document number is there. There is no description on the SOP side because you are doing line item invoicing, whereas on the receivables management side there is a description that you can print out. The document number will default on both of them. Pick a customer number, and then you can go through. You can add a ship to address on the SOP side. If we did have a true SOP set up, we might have different sites where we were actually taking stuff out of inventory. Luckily, none of our companies really do inventory management here at W Squared, so all of our default sites will just be main. You can put in a customer PO number if they are sending you POs. And then you just simply go in and you select items that you want to invoice. Hopefully the items are already set up. If not, that would be a separate training because inventory module is a complete separate module that we don't use as a true inventory module. We just use it to set up items. Same thing like we talked about in the financial. You can expand the line item just by clicking these arrows. I can then go in and change my description. I can go in and do a markdown on this one item if I want to. My unit price, let's just say, is $100, things like that. And I can go in and change all that stuff right here. Another way to change that is anytime if I highlight a line and I hit this, the little blue arrows, that's kind of a drill down as well. So, for instance, on this item number, I can hit this blue arrow, and it should pull up my sales item detail. I can change all the same stuff, change the description, change quantity, do all that right here. The important piece on this sales item detail entry is the distributions. When you're dealing with SOP, these three distribution items have to be in that item. So even if it's a service item, you have to have a cost of sales. If you don't, this invoice will not post. So if you ever have an invoice that you're trying to post and it does not, this is the first place to look. Now, don't get, the one thing that a lot of people will do is get this confused. This is the sales item detail. There's also a distribution right here on the sales transaction. This is just a summary of the sales transaction. This is balanced. Everything looks good. But if this distribution over here is not set up this way, it's not going to post. So keep that in mind if you're ever having issues posting invoices. As I said, you can add multiple line items to one thing. You can change your invoice quantities, all that, and then you get a total. Typically, you'll add it to a batch as well. Save that batch. Then at the end of the entry, you can do, in the batch, you can do kind of some control checks. So you would have, you can do the number of transactions or a batch total, meaning how much should you be invoicing. And then you would have an actual count right here of the way that works. Now, the control does not have to be put in there, but you can do it if you want to. I don't think anybody ever has, though. Once you get everything done in there, you just hit save, and then you move on to the next one. Oh, let me backtrack one thing. You can add comment IDs so that basically, thank you for your business. You can set up a comment ID to maybe include ACH information, all kinds of stuff down here. And to simply change that, all you can do is, if you've got a comment out there and you want to add to it, again, hit the blue arrow, and then I can type something else in that comment, and that would just be for this one invoice. Whereas if I click on this comment ID, the link field, now I'm changing the actual, what that payment says, what that payment comment says, and it's saving it globally over the entire system. So that's an important feature to keep in mind. Once you get done with everything, you can just print it. You print it to the printer or to the screen, whatever. Once you do print it, you cannot delete it. little bit different than the financial series. If something is ever printed out of the sales module, the way that they look at it is that invoice could possibly be sent out. We don't want to be able to use that invoice number again. So once you print it, you have to void it. If you have not printed yet, you can just simply delete it. So keep that in mind as well if you're trying to delete a printed invoice. That'll get a lot of people. The other options that might be used on the sales transaction entry window is a return. Let's say you have an item that you truly invoice, and then the customer wants to see a return for that item. You can do that as well here in the sales entry or sales transaction entry. I'm going to delete that. Moving on to the receivables transaction entry. Same type of thing. Put in your description, your batch ID, document date, customer number. It then gives you the address, things like that. Gives you the, you can put in a PO number right here. And then you would put the item in on, here it's on credit amount, since it is a credit memo. If I'm doing sales, I'm doing sales down here, things like that. Cost is going to be kind of the offset. So if I did sales of $1,000 and it cost me $800, I can put the cost right there so that when I look at my distributions, it's going to do the correct journal entries. Typically, we don't use trade discount, freight, or miscellaneous because we just put it all in the one field right here. Going back, one important feature or one thing to note again, kind of going back to what we talked about, the comment. On payment terms, if you go in and you select a payment term of, let's say, net 30, if I want to change this one invoice for some reason and change my due date, I can then click that blue arrow, and I can say, you know, my due date is on such and such date. No problem. That changes it just for this one invoice. If I click on payment terms and I change my net days from 30 to 45 and hit save, that changes the entire system-wide net 30 payment days. We have had clients before that have done that. They've changed it here so that in payables or receivables, everything now defaults to 45 when you pick that net 30. So definitely important to keep that in mind when you're changing any of that information. Again, some of the things that we do in receivables transaction entry is you have sales invoice, debit memos. Typically don't use finance charges or service and repairs or warranties, but we could use credit memos or returns here as well. If you are doing a credit memo, one thing that you also need to keep in mind is you can apply it to other documents that are outstanding already. So for instance, if I say I've got a credit memo of $100 or $10, I can go in and apply it to an outstanding invoice to clear it off of these guys don't have one, but if there were, you would see line items and then you just check, oh, I want to apply it to this invoice to clear that out. And delete that. Moving on to the inquiry side of sales, and this is primarily where most of the accountants are going to be working. You have a couple options. You can look at transaction by customer or transaction by document. Exactly what it says. If I want to look at one customer, I can go in here and I can see all the history, meaning they had one invoice with 2 payments on that invoice. No big deal there. If I want to drill down, I can say, oh, document number is this, and then look and see the detail behind it. The amount remaining, what that drills down and tells me is if there was something applied to it, or if it were a cash receipt, if it were applied to something, you can drill down and see what it was applied to or what paid that invoice. Another easy way to see if the invoice is open or closed is expanding the details. So now my amount remaining is 0. on these. If the invoice still had an open balance, it might say $100 right there instead of 0. So that's a real quick, easy way to see if the document has been paid or not. If the document was voided, what you would see next to this word where it says HIST, you would see an asterisk. Basically what that means is it was entered, posted, and then later on somebody went in and voided it. It would also show an amount remaining right here. So keep that in mind when you're looking at amount remaining, is to also check and see if it's been voided or not. Going back to the table structures in GP, you can sort by work, open, and history. So meaning if I want to just look at invoices that are not posted, I'm just looking at ones that are saved out there but not posted, I can make it say just work, hit redisplay, and if there were any out there, it would bring it up and show me just the work ones. Where that's helpful is if you have vendors or customers that have a lot of history, you're able to go in and see only those specific items, maybe just open ones, which would be current year versus previous years. Open would also include, for the payable side, it would show you items that were not paid. In payables, once it's paid, it moves to history. So that helps you search a little bit more. In the drop-down, in the inquiry in payables and receivables is very similar. That's why I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the sales side, and then on the payable side, it'll just kind of be a little something you've already seen. But when I sort, I can sort by the document number or the document date, and I can also search by document date. So if I wanted to look for just current year stuff, whether it was open history or not, I could do that. And then it will also sort it by the document date when you choose that selection. You might have to hit redisplay, things like that. When looking at transaction by document, you can do the same type of thing. You can do it by document date, customer ID, things of that nature. If I'm doing it by document number, I can also just key in one document right here. Let's say if I know it and I don't want to scroll through it, I can go in and go like this, search through a range, hit redisplay, and then it's going to bring up that one document that you're searching for, and then everything else looks kind of like the transaction by customer. You got my amount remaining, got it where it's in history, open, or work, my doc date, due date, all that good stuff is same type of look. On a lot of these period summaries, things like that, you're looking at a customer. The one thing to note is we don't typically close our GL, so sometimes this might not be 100% accurate just because of the way that we don't close that stuff. I think on the receivable side they have done a better job at looking at the summaries and things like that, so that helps out. But on the payable side, it's basically not going to be too helpful because we don't close AP just because of the process. It's kind of cumbersome. Not really used too much on the period yearly summary, but if you need it, you can definitely pull that out real quick. Same type of thing as the receivables management. This part is considered the receivables management. This part is considered the sales or the SOP. So in this case, I would just be searching for cash receipts. I would be searching for any sort of document that involves sales. Under sales documents, I'm only looking at actual invoices and not cash receipts, things like that. Moving up to the cards of sales. So this is where you would input all the customers, if you have new customers, things like that. I'll just select a new one or select one that's already existing to go through the required fields and go through the options. So when looking here, the customer number is definitely needed, or customer ID. You can put them on hold or inactive, things like that. If they are put on hold, you can still post cash receipts, but you cannot do sales to them anymore. Inactive just basically means you can't post anything to them. The name, short name, and statement name pretty much default for you, so you don't need to change anything on that. Or excuse me, the short name and statement name default. The name is you type in. Class IDs are important. Basically, what the class IDs are is ways to group your customers or your vendors. Some examples that we use might be whether or not they pay with ACH. That may be a class ID, and then that way you can very easily sort those vendors. It may be for AP, it may be, oh, this is an employee, or this is a contractor, or this is a ACH. You know, basically any way to group your customers or vendors is what the class IDs are used for. For example, in Med Center we use DVC is one, ACH, credit card, meaning they pay with their credit card, and then everybody else is just a default class. The address ID, you can add multiple address IDs, so you could have like a ship to, a remit to, a primary, maybe a physical one. You can have multiple address IDs. Whatever the one is right here is kind of what you consider the primary or the default address ID. And then when you do transactions, you can pick these address IDs based on how many you have set up. Phone number, all that self-explanatory. You can change on customers and vendors the ship to, bill to, statement to. You can default a salesperson if you have salespeople set up. Most of our companies do not have that. I think Med Center is the primary one that does salespeople. So that is you know, a good thing that we use that, because then we can track every invoice by who the salesperson is on that invoice. You can default the payment terms for this customer, all kinds of things like that. Typically, we do not add accounts to the sales to the customer, just because most of the time we're using the item inventories and not the customer accounts. So in here, it's in this customer card, but it's not needed. Under options, one thing that you have to do on almost every customer that is set up is the default is to set them up as no credit. If you have no credit, you can't go in and do a sales transaction and post it to AR. They have to pay with cash or something. So almost every customer, we go in and just default to unlimited, just because of the nature of our business. If we were truly taking orders from somebody and we were in, you know, a sales order processing company, you might set them up to have a limit that they could order, you know, where, hey, they're calling in, getting goods, we're shipping them goods, and then once they get behind, if they meet their limit, then it warns you. It says, hey, don't send them any more goods because they're over their limit. So that's one thing that we always set up, is keep them unlimited. You can also add in, you know, statement emails. You can set in credit card IDs or credit card numbers, things like that. Not many of our companies use that, just because of the sensitivity of that. We don't want a bunch of credit cards out there. A couple of them do use it, but if you don't need access to that company, you don't see it. So it's kind of on a need-to-know basis of who gets to see that information anyways. Project is used for project accounting. In most of the time, most of our companies, you guys won't see that. There's only a handful, mainly W Squared, but there's a couple others that use project. Most of the time, you guys probably won't see the project side of it. One important thing in the sales module that we can use is called national accounts. This is not available in the vendors or the payables module. But what this does is, let's say if I have an AT&T as my customer. AT&T could be a national account, and then you can create little customers or children customers underneath each one of them. So what I do is you would go in here, set up a parent customer ID, and in Med Center, they do, the difference is If they're a regular customer, they use a 5-digit ID. If they're a national account, we use the actual name of the company. If I can get this to scroll down. So, for instance, a Medisys is a national account. Basically, what happens is we have 5 or 6 of Medisys locations that advertise with MedCenter, and then they may pay with one check. So in this case, if we set up a parent company and then put the children underneath it, we can go in and put a cash receipt. We can invoice by each one of these children and send it to where it needs to go and track it by that child's customer ID. But then when they pay us, we can go in and put cash receipts under that parent so that we don't have to split one check into 10 different customer IDs or 10 different cash receipts. It also allows a way that if you need to do some reporting, you can report on the parent instead of just the child and then have to manipulate the data to get it to come in the way you want. You can just say, oh, I want to pick a Medisys and go with that. To set up the parent, all you do is set up a normal customer, then select it here in the national account maintenance. Then you just simply go in and you start picking and choosing what accounts fall under that parent customer ID, and then it just adds it to it. So pretty easy to add those in there. And then you can, as you can see, you can very easily see the current balance in each children that they have. Going back, you can also look at some summary stuff over here. Look at the customer. So if I want to say how much did a customer do this year, I can pick one. We typically, under the summary view, we don't use amount since last close. You're going to use fiscal year or calendar year. And then you can just say, okay, 2012, oh, there's nothing. And then I can go, 2011, calculate. So life to date, they have $180, which actually is probably in 2012. And hit calculate. So there it is, under year to date. Just a quick way, if you ever have a question, probably not used a whole lot, but it is out there. Customer vendor, what that allows you to do, most of the time you guys wouldn't be setting that up, but it links a customer with a vendor ID so that if they have a refund or something along those lines, you can go in and simply take, if they have a credit balance on their sales account, you can transfer that credit balance over to a payables refund check. And then that way you're using the system as an ERP system that links everything together. This is also where you would set up your salespeople if you want to track invoices by salespeople. You can set up sales territories if you have different regions within your company, things like that. We don't use the lock feature right now. Maybe later down the road we might look at that with some of the healthcare companies we have. But that you also can look at collections. We typically don't use the collection module, but if it is needed, we do have that available to us, where you can run queries to send out, letters of, hey, you're behind on your invoices, pay this amount. You can send out dunning letters, which basically, say if you don't pay by a certain date or a certain time, you will be referred to a lawyer, things like that, so that you're sending out letters and giving them nasty grams if you need to. Moving on to the reports for sales, same thing, we'll just go to trial balance. I would highly suggest always using historical age trial balance instead of the age trial balance. What the age trial balance does is it's going to take whatever it is of today. You can't go back and say, I want to run it as of February 29th. And 99% of the time for the accountants, they're really worried about it during close. Occasionally you might worry about it when you're dealing with the, if you're sending out a current age trial balance to the salespeople, and then you can run this great macro that we have created by one Mr. Chris Tucker that we use a lot. But 99% of the time, the historical age trial balance is what you're going to use. Same thing, you can save the different options out there. So this one is trial balance probably using the current day, where this one is using the end of the previous month. Once we go in and modify, you can, one thing to always look at is whether you're running it by GL posting date or document date. GL posting date is the way we're going to run most of our trial balances, just because you could legitimately post something in 1 month with a document date of 2 or 3 months ago. Pretty much everything we exclude except the credit balance, and then you can sort your documents however you want to sort them, by document number, document date, due date, things like that. The one difference between the financial and the receivables trial balance is when you're running a summary, you run it from the same screen. It's just whether or not the in detail is checked or not. So you don't have to go in and out of the financial or out of the different reports, whether you want summary or detail. Then you can select your ranges, sort it by whatever you want. If you want it by state, if you want it by customer ID, maybe I only want to run it for a certain class ID that I'm using. You can do all that right here with your ranges, and then insert, check your destination, and hit print. Once you do that, the report will go to screen or go to a printer, whatever you've got selected. The one thing that we touched base on a while ago was you can add a report to our homepage. If you want to add a report to my homepage, all you do is simply open the report, hit My Reports, name it what you want, hit OK. Then when I go out to the homepage, that report should now show up on my homepage. And again, that's just for ease of running the report. If you want to just run the report with one click of the button, you can add it to that My Report section, and now it ends up and shows up right here under that section. The other thing that is important to note in the reports is, let's say you go in and you post a batch of invoices, and you want to keep that posting detail or the posting reports. You can go in and run posting journal reports right here. So you have a whole slew of options to choose from: cash receipts, receivables posting, sales posting, voided, invoicing, commissions. All these are items that you can go back and reprint. So if you forget to print something out at the time of posting, you can always go back and get it somehow. And typically at W Squared, we don't print out all those reports as backup, because if we need it, we can go and get it if the auditors want to see it. So this is where you would go get that if it needs to be reprinted. And then, so moving on to the purchasing module, we're going to skim over the purchasing module very fast because it is set up very similar to the receivables or the sales module. Same type of thing. You've got transaction entry. You've got all that information in here. If we go in, this is where AP is going to enter their transactions. They just simply go in here to transaction entry, type in the description, type in the vendor and all the required information, put in their amount, and then this is where they code the distributions to. So very similar screen to the transaction entry in sales, but excuse me, in receivables, but this one is the purchasing. One thing that is very different is this 1099 amount. If a vendor is set up as a 1099 vendor, that 1099 amount defaults to whatever the purchases are, and then the AP person has to go in and change it if it's not a full, if the invoice is not fully 1099 fit under those requirements. Once they go in and post everything, again, it flows through the GL, so you don't have to do anything with that. You do have manual payments, which is something a little bit different. So most of the AP transactions are paid by a computer check, meaning it goes through the normal process of AP. You input an invoice into the transaction entry. It then posts to the AP account and sits out there until we do our weekly check run. When you do your weekly check run, you build the batch, you print a computer check, and then you send it out, and everything is posted correctly. What the manual payment entry is for is if you, maybe the client might pay with a manual check, that they actually hand wrote a check to a vendor that was there at their office that day and said, no, you got to pay up today. They then send us the manual check. This is where they would go. They could go in if we've already seen the invoice and it's already in AP. This is how you would go in and then pay for that invoice. And it doesn't print out a check. All it does is clears it out of AP. It also, you can type in the document number, meaning the check number that came from the manual check, so that you match the bank records as well. A lot of times ACHs, if companies go in, like maybe phone bills, maybe the utilities are just automatically ACH, that's where you would also use this manual payment entry. Most of the time AP is going to do this for you. You just take the backup to them and they'll take care of that for you. The select checks, print blank checks, edit check batch, all that is AP function, and as an accountant you won't even have access. You'll have access to it, but you don't have the ability to run the checks because you don't have the password to run the checks. Going back, one thing I did skip over on the receivable side, and it is different on the payable side, is this apply payables document. What that is for, and there's an apply receivables document, is you can go in and change on the receivable side, you can go in and change what a cash receipt is or a credit memo is applied to. This apply payables document, you can go in, if you have entered a credit memo, you can go in and apply it to an invoice. You cannot change, if you created a computer check and printed it and sent it out, you cannot then go back and change where that computer check is applied to. You have to void that check or find other means to do it, which takes you to the void historical transaction. If a document is fully paid, the check and the invoice automatically get transferred to historical. So this is where you would void the check. And then if you had to void the actual invoice, you would void the open transaction right here. Edit transaction information. There are a few items you can edit once an item is posted, meaning the due date, discount date, or the PO number or description. So if you need to edit any of that, this is the place to do it. But for most fields, once a transaction is posted, you cannot edit anything on that transaction. The series post, and I kind of skipped over that on the other modules just because then we can show a little bit more on the payable side. All modules, or the core modules, have what's called series post, where I could go in and post all these batches at one time. So if you've got 5 or 6 batches that you need to post, instead of posting them individually, you just go in here and hit mark all, or mark the ones that you want to post and hit post. Now, one thing on the payable side and the receivable side as an accountant you have to watch out for is the frequency. We kind of talked about the frequency of batches in the financial side. You don't want to go in and post these batches if they are monthly recurring batches, because you are then posting it for AP. Let AP handle the posting of the recurring batches. What you will do is essentially post this on today, and it may not need to be posted today. They may have already posted Marches, and so now you're doubling up in the month that you want to post it. So keep in mind when you go into series post whether or not it's a monthly or a single batch, and whether or not you need to post it. We have had examples where somebody saw them out there and said, oh, they're batches, they should be posted then. And then they posted these monthly recurring batches for AP, which they weren't real happy about. The inquiry is very similar to the receivables and the sales module, kind of like we discussed. You have transaction by vendor and transaction by document. So I'm not going to go into that a whole lot, but that's where you look at that information. You can look at the, different totals for the vendor right here. Not a whole lot to go into with that. It's very self-explanatory if you're looking at the yearly or the period totals or things like that. So we'll skip over some of that. Going to the vendor cards, it looks very similar to the customer card. We pick a vendor, same type of thing. You can set up a vendor as active, inactive, or temporary. Most of them are going to be active. You can make them inactive, which doesn't allow you to key anything to them. And then if you put them as temporary, you can actually delete them with another process, but we won't go into that today. You still have the class IDs for vendors, much like receivables, so you can, in MedCenter, they use refunds, they use salespeople, recurring payables, employee, kind of some of the stuff we talked about earlier. Everything else is very similar to the receivable side. You can add a vendor account number if you have that on file. You can add it right here. Going into the options, you can default the payment terms on them. This tax ID is where you set up the 1099 information. So this would be their social or their federal identification number. You can then change the tax type to the different boxes on the 1099 form, and then you can also do the 1099 box. So if it's non-employee compensation or if it's rent, things like that, you can change right here. Most of the time, AP is going to take care of that, but I think it is important to know how to change that if you need to for different vendors. Credit limit here is unlimited. It defaults to that for AP side, which is good, and we don't ever change that. Nothing else really in this screen to really set up. You can set up multiple addresses, kind of like in the receivable side. Simply add more addresses as needed. The one thing, and this is both for receivables and payables, this is where you set up the ACH information. If your company is using ACH, you set up the ACH information right here for that vendor. This would be where I select the United States, since we're dealing with that, and then we just put in the transit, the routing number and the bank number, and then we can create EFT files. Not going to go into that a whole lot, but it is an option with each vendor or each company that we have if we're using online treasury management. You can also set up accounts, kind of like in the receivables. Again, we run that all off of the accounts payable runs off the master setup. The one thing that you will see a lot of is the default purchases accounts. What AP uses that for is when they key in a transaction, if there is a default purchases account, that defaults in on the transaction, helps them with keying stuff. If you click on this little ellipse over here, you can add multiple accounts and default on the transaction. One thing to note on that, if AP keeps coding something to the wrong account month in and month out, it's most likely because they've got it defaulted right here. Instead of you reclassing every month, just go and tell them or go in here and change it for them. Say, you know what, this is really not rent, it's really a CAM charge and should be set up as something different, or it's a utility charge. Go in and add it for them or change it for them, because they would rather have it correct, and it saves you time from reclassing every single month. So if you get that a lot, check the purchases account to see where it's defaulted. Again, project, we're not really using a whole lot of project because that is only a few customers use that, so we won't go into that. Card those changes. Addresses, we already touched on. Summary, same thing as receivables. You can go through. This one, however, you can't choose whether it's off fiscal year or last amount since last close. So you probably won't ever use this this window because it's not 100% correct. the way that we close the year. If you need to look at 1099 details for a vendor, you can look at that there as well, and go for this screen to see, what their 1099 year to date is. Most of the time, the accounts don't need to deal with that. AP deals with that. Moving on to the reports. Under the reports, same options as receivables. Again, always use the historical age trial balance, and then you can go in and change your options in here. And set up almost the exact same way as the receivable side. If you want to run summary, click or uncheck the in detail, things like that. Again, we showed this on the receivable side. If you want to save this report to your home page, just add My Reports, type in what you want it called, hit OK, and then it'll save it to your home screen under that My Reports window that we talked about earlier. Not going to spend a whole lot of more time on the report side. Again, posting journals are out there. You can get check information reports. That can be helpful. There's another way that we typically get that out, and which is called Smart List. I'm not going to go over that right at this time, but we will touch base on it here a little bit later. Moving on, we're going to kind of just really quickly go through fixed assets and then go through what Smart List is, what Integration Manager is, and the third-party products we use. So under fixed assets, you do have an option to pick fixed assets over here, but most of the time it's a lot easier, you just go through the financial for fixed assets. You don't have a navigation pane. And as you can see, you can expand or collapse the fixed asset pieces that are associated with it. Fixed assets is a little backwards in the sense that most of the time when we're posting stuff, we do it here under transactions. Most of the time when you're dealing with fixed assets, you're going to deal under cards and then under routines and under utilities. So for instance, if we have a new asset that we need to add to our subledger, you have to add the general card, which gives you your general information, meaning the asset ID, the description, the class ID. Class ID is very similar to the class ID in receivables and payables. The only difference is you also default an account group to it, which tells it where to post the accumulated depreciation, the depreciation expense, all that kind of good information. Select your acquisition date, which is typically your invoice date that you receive. Your acquisition cost is, the invoice cost. You can set up physical location and location IDs. The two biggest differences when I think of those two, physical location could be, it could be, if we're looking at W squared, it could be conference room 1, conference room 2, where it actually sits, where the location ID could be, corporate versus it could be down at Peak 10 where we have another office. You could look at it that way. Or you could even look at location ID as a city, meaning Nashville or Brentwood, where maybe we have 2 offices in Brentwood, so the physical ID might be office building 1 versus office building 2. A lot of ways you can play around with that. When using a third-party product that we'll talk about, the location ID has to be the 5-digit location string from our GL. We'll go over that at a later date, but keep that in mind. You can also, if you use asset labels, you can put that asset label in here, as well as custodian if there's an owner of that fixed asset. If you want to put manufacturer name, you can also include serial numbers. So if you're tracking, you want to track something by a serial number, you can put that in here. You have to be very detailed in your records if you're going to track that kind of stuff. Most of the time we don't get that from clients, but it is an option that you can track that stuff by. Once you get a asset set up in the general card, you then have to add it to the book. What the book is it tells it how you're going to treat the depreciation of this asset. you can set up multiple books in the fixed asset ledger, so you could have, your straight line gap book, you could have a tax book, you could have an AMT book, things like that. Most of the time, all we worry about is the gap straight line book, because we let the tax accountants deal with the tax depreciation. But all you have to do is when you have the asset pulled up, you just hit this little card in the upper right-hand corner, and you can look at the accounts. So this is where the accounts are getting coded to. So when we run depreciation and post it, it's going to hit the accumulated depreciation account, and it's going to hit my depreciation expense account. That's where, if you need to review that. But going to the book, and like I said, we usually only have one book. This is where you're setting up and telling it how to depreciate this asset. So we had a place in service date of 9/11/2008. It depreciated through August 31st of 2010, and it did have an original life of 2 years, so it is fully depreciated already. This is going to be this beginning year cost. That defaults and updates every time we do fixed asset year-end close. My cost basis is typically just going to be your inventory or your invoice amount. If this was not fully depreciated and it was running depreciation for the year, you would see a year-to-date amount or a life-to-date amount. You can also click on this to go in and kind of see how it was depreciated. So this is the way that the FA periods are set up is the 4-digit year and then the 3-digit period. I don't know why they use 3 digits, because most of the time you're only going to use 2 for the month. So that's what that 3-digit is really the month. 009 is really September, and so forth. But you can, go through and look and see everything that's happened with this asset when it was depreciated and all that information. You can also look at when it was added and how that was, and actually drill down to a journal entry, and it tells you a batch ID, the date it was posted. You can drill down to a lot of information on individual fixed assets. Once you have that all in place, you can just save it and go from there. Be careful, because you can delete the book information. It will give you a warning, but you can delete book information without deleting a general asset, and then your reports will be off, because the reports run, the monthly depreciation reports we run to tie to the balance sheet are run off of this book code that we have up in here. The monthly routines for fixed assets are under the routines. Now, if we're under the financial navigation pane, we just go under routines. If we were going to navigate using our menu options, it's under Microsoft Dynamics GP, Tools, Routines, Fixed Assets. So, and then this is where you do all your monthly routines and things like that. So, for instance, I would run my depreciation here, pick my target date, which is usually the end of the month you're closing, insert the book, and hit depreciate. When you run that depreciation, that does not post it to the GL. All the other modules are integrated to post. You can set them up to post to the GL, which we do, so that when you post an entry or a transaction to the subledger, it automatically flows all the way to the GL, no problem there. With the fixed asset module, you actually have to go in and do the GL posting. So at the end of the month, I would go in and run my depreciation. Then my next step would be to run this GL posting. I always leave my beginning period as zeros, because then it'll pick up any previous months if I've changed anything. And then my ending period would be, if I was closing February, it'd be 2012 002, and then my transaction date is that last date. Once you get that right, you just hit continue, and it's going to do the GL posting and create a batch. Then you go out under transactions, and you can do it under series post or batches to post that batch. Same thing with reports. It's under the report option of financial. 99% of the time you run this depreciation report, and then you run depreciation by class. And again, you can make it in detail or in summary just by checking there, and then you just run this monthly, and that's kind of your backup for your balance sheet. Most of the time we run it in summary and then worry about the detail if we need it at year end for audits and things like that. So with that, that's pretty much the. Or let me step back. Under transactions for fixed assets, there are a couple things to note. I'm not going to go into it real long, but this is where you retire a fixed asset. So if you sell a fixed asset, or you dispose of it, or it gets damaged, you can retire it here. If you put in the correct information, it will actually book everything the way you need it. So you can retire partial. Let's say if you have a quantity of 5 on the fixed asset card and you only need to retire 1, you would just retire a quantity of 1. If you know the cost you're going to retire, you can do that. Or if you know the percent that you're going to retire, let's say 50% got retired, you can do that as well. And then it'll calculate, you can enter cash proceeds, and you can also, it'll calculate the gain and loss on the asset and book that accordingly. Some of the modules that we do not use in GP is, like I said, the native Great Plains Bank Rec. So under the financial, you see Advanced Bank Rec. What we use is a product called, it's Nolan Advanced Bank Rec. And what it allows us to do is you set it up so that you tell it this cash account is associated with this checkbook. You then pull in the GL information. It doesn't matter where that transaction came from. You pull in all the GL transactions, upload the bank statement, and then you go in and match them up. With the native Great Plains Bank Rec, you have to go in and do a lot of transactions in the subledger, which are not good for uploads if you're using just general transactions. It's kind of you're doing double the work that you need to do. So that's why we have this third-party product with the number of clients we have. That's something that you will get trained on once you get into that piece of it. There are some other reporting options under the different modules. For instance, you have advanced financial, things like that, financial statements. We do not use that at W Squared because we do use FRX, and those are kind of obsolete. They're old products that are in GP that really nobody uses. So if you're wondering what those are, you're never going to use them. So just kind of mention that so that we know not to spend time and try to figure out what those are. I'm going to move on to Smart List. So if I go to Microsoft Dynamics GP and Smart List, what Smart List is it's basically a way to just pull data out. If I want all my general ledger transactions for a month, I can pull it from Smart List very easily. If I want all my purchasing or my sales transactions for a month, it's just a way to get data out and export it to Excel. And as you notice, each thing is set up kind of the same way that the modules are set up. So you have financial, fixed assets, purchasing, sales, things like that. And then you just go in, expand the folder, and then it's kind of set up, think of the same way as the cards and transactions. So summary would be, account summary would technically be a inquiry type screen. Account transactions is where you're downloading the transactions for a period of time or things like that. Accounts, you can download all the GL accounts that are set up, things like that. When you're in one of these, so if it's an asterisk, that means it's a straight out of the box a Smart List report. Now you can go in and double click on that, and you can do searches or do add columns, things like that. again, like I said, I'm not going to go into it heavily because you could spend 3 days on Smart List. It's something that you'll learn to use and ask questions as you're going along with it, because it is very, very robust, and you can do a lot of different things with it. And like I said, we could spend days on days of using it. But as you can see, it's pulling up all of my transactions that I posted in the GL. Or actually, this is all my accounts. So it's counting, saying, okay, it's pulling all the accounts. It's only going to pull the first 10,000. The normal default is 1,000 on a lot of those. And then once it's completed, I can hit Excel, and it'll just pull that data to the Excel spreadsheet, and then you can do what you want with it there. Moving on to Integration Manager real quick. If you go up here to Microsoft Dynamics GP, go to Tools, Integrate, and Run Integration. This is a list of all of our integrations that we currently use. What it is moving data from a source file into GP so that you don't have to rekey data. You can set up templates in Excel that you can use as a general journal entry. We use it for sales transactions from other sources, such as other inventory modules or sales modules that maybe our client tracks in third-party billing type stuff. We can use it for really anything. Upload chart of accounts, upload vendors, upload customers, anything that you already have in a spreadsheet form, we can most likely manipulate it to get it into the system as needed. So not going to spend a ton of time on that. Again, that will be touched on once we get into working in GP and things like that. Moving on to the third-party products that we use, there's a couple of them. I just note them in case you guys hear them. One is the Nolan Intercompany or Nolan ABR, which we discussed previously. Again, it's here under Financial, and this is a way to reconcile the bank transactions. Third-party product, a little bit easier than the native Great Plains product for bank rec. Also gives you a little bit better reporting features and ways to match up your transactions. The same company, different product is called Nolan Intercompany. We don't use that currently, but if you have intercompany between different departments,